Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar Identity-Driven Security, the Key to Zero Trust by our speaker Jason Garbus. I am Shilpa Goswami and I'll be your host for the day. We would like to go over a few house rules for our attendees. The session will be in listen-only mode and will last for an hour, out of which the last 10 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to organizers or our speakers, use the Q&A window. Also, if you face any audio-video challenges, please check your internet connections or you may log out and log in again. An important announcement for certificate of attendance. Participants need to attend the complete webinar to qualify for the certificate. Also, should fill in the survey form, which will be sent in the attendees' thank you email and answer correctly the 3 multiple choice questions based on the webinar. The certificate of attendance shall be sent to you within the next 5 to 7 working days after the event. Our speaker for today's session, Jason Garbus, is founder and principal at Numberline Security, a consulting firm providing zero trust security, education, and advisory services. He is the author of Zero Trust Security and Enterprise Guide, co-chair of the Zero Trust Working Group at the Cloud Security Alliance, and is a frequent contributor to and speaker at industry conferences. Jason holds a CISSP certification, a BS in Computer Science from Cornell, and an MBA from Northeastern. Professionally, he is expertise in identity management, enterprise security architecture, network security, and security strategy. Previously, he served as Chief Product Officer at Appgate and held roles at security firms, including RSA and Avexa. Without any further delay, I would hand over the session to you, Jason.
Great. Thank you, Shilpi, and thank you to the EC Council team for giving me the opportunity to present here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. As you can see, I spent a lot of time focused on and thinking about and talking to people about zero trust. And I'm a really big believer in the zero trust approach being a fundamentally better way to approach security. And the fact that it takes an identity-centric view is really important because it overcomes so many of the weaknesses of traditional security architectures and security approaches, and it's something that we really need in our industry. So let's dive into this. We're going to cover an introduction to zero trust, talk about what it is, why we need it, and why we really need it now. Also touch on the core zero trust principles and what a zero trust policy model should look like, which is really at the heart of how and why identity is so important to what we're trying to do and how we're trying to change things for zero trust. I'll also explain and go through the latest update to the Zero Trust Maturity Model that came out just this week or last week from the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's a pretty well-regarded and influential maturity model in the industry, and it's worth spending some time looking at. And then we'll wrap up and talk a little bit about how you can begin your zero trust journey and some guidance there. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the first question is, why has this thing called zero trust really taken hold in the industry? Why do we so urgently need to change the way that we're approaching our security? And the first thing I think that we can all agree with is that information security as an industry is really failing to keep up with the threat landscape. And that's not because we don't have all of us who work really hard at this. We don't have software vendors that are working to improve the security of their solutions. It's clear that there's so much value from cyber criminals, from nation states, and from espionage, as well as just people who want to disrupt things, that there's a constant barrage of attacks and a constant investment in offensive tools and literal armies of people whose job it is to break into and exploit our infrastructures. And this has had a lot of impact, very expensive and very disruptive impact on our governments, on our infrastructure, on our commercial sector, and on us as individuals. And one of the reasons for this is that everything, of course, is now connected and easily connectable. And the technology really hasn't been able to, our security technology hasn't been able to keep up with all of the advances in cloud computing, the adoption of infrastructure and platform as a service. These things are really amazing and really valuable for our businesses, but they have changed the way that networking and security is used. In those platforms, they use a different model from traditional on-premises network security stacks and things like that. And it's really forced IT to scramble. And in many cases, they really fall back on just providing broad network access and not tying in the best practices that have been put in place in enterprise environments around principal of least privilege, et cetera. So as we've probably heard, traditional security architectures are built on a castle and moat or perimeter-centric type of model, where elements outside the network are untrusted, things are blocked at the firewall, but when a device or an individual or a piece of software is running on the internal enterprise network, that it becomes trusted. And that is a big flaw, and it's something that we've seen malware and ransomware unfortunately be able to, to take advantage of. Excuse me. I'm going to stop those beeps. Hold on. Okay, I apologize for that interruption. The traditional network and security infrastructure wasn't designed with security in mind. We think about this, go back in time to when TCP/IP was created in the 1970s. The amazing innovators and brilliant people who created that did a fantastic job of allowing computer systems to easily connect to each other across a network. And they were aware of security. It wasn't a priority for them, and they didn't really have the capacity in those very primitive computing and networking infrastructure to be able to add security. So they said, okay, we're going to make it easy for these devices to connect to each other, and security can be handled at the application level. And that's carried through all the way to today. If you think about a firewall rule, even in the most advanced infrastructure as a service platforms, they have these concepts of security groups, and essentially they have traditional 5-tuple firewall rules in there that say things like, allow source IP address 10.524 to access this target IP address 10.2.344 on a certain port using a certain protocol. That's a terrific structure from a networking perspective and a terrible structure from a security perspective. So what this means is that, of course, we want to encourage our businesses and our enterprises and our governments to take advantage of these new technologies because they are really worthwhile and they allow us to innovate and solve our business problems and to do things that we need to do. But we need to take an approach to security that overcomes these weaknesses of traditional infrastructure and, in fact, changes our mindset from a default allow to a default deny approach from a network, from an access perspective. And that's really this concept of zero trust, which is get rid of the trusted networks, get rid of the trust in the system, and only allow network packets or connections or data or users to flow across the network to access things if and only if they're positively authenticated, and if there's a policy that gets evaluated that said, you know what, we know who this identity is, we know what device they're connecting from, we know why they should be allowed to access a given resource right now, and we're going to allow it. We also have to recognize that breaches are likely to happen, and when bad things happen, the infrastructure and the security platform needs to make sure that it can contain that. So if this is this notion of reducing the blast radius, where if an individual, maybe they click on a malicious link and they get malware in their device, that's bad, but if it can be contained to that one device, if that malware can be prevented from doing network reconnaissance or moving laterally across the network or infecting our whole enterprise, then that's a big win. One infected device that we have to destroy or re-image or throw away, we lose the data on it, okay, it's a small loss, but it's not something that is going to be an existential threat to our enterprise or a major incident. And that's a much, much better place to much less better place to be. Finally, zero trust is a change in the security philosophy, but it has to, I would say, we want to make sure that when enterprises approach this, they don't view this as a gigantic multi-year project before they see any value. It's really, really important to get momentum and deliver value to the organization quickly in a small number of months, so that businesses, because businesses have to prioritize budget and people's times, they need to see business value out of this quickly, so that it's not just a security-led academic project that doesn't deliver value from a business perspective. So if we think about what zero trust is, there's lots of definitions out there, but there are two real primary ones that in the industry are well regarded and well accepted. So the first comes from what is called the NSTAC report. So this is an organization that the President of the United States basically has created, called the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, or NSTAC. They conducted a series of interviews with industry experts, both inside the government and outside the government, and issued a report on zero trust and trusted identity management. And this came out just at the beginning of last year, 2022. And in that report, you can see the first quote here. They talk about zero trust as a cybersecurity strategy. So it's not an architecture, it's not a product, it's a strategy, premised on the idea that no user or asset is to be implicitly trusted. So this notion of eliminating our implicit trust. It assumes that a breach has already occurred or will occur, and therefore a user, an identity or device, should not be granted access to sensitive information by single verification done at the enterprise perimeter. Traditional VPNs, traditional firewalls did exactly that, and we know the many reasons in which they were flawed. And to wrap up the NSTAC quote, it says each user, device, application, and transaction must be continually verified. And we'll talk a little bit in a couple of slides around what exactly that means in the different systems that interact to do that. The second definition comes from the United States National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST. So they released a very influential report called Zero Trust Architectures in August of 2020. And that's a very, very useful report to read. It talks about the core principles. And they say that zero trust is not a single architecture, but a set of guiding principles for workflow system design and operations that can be used to improve the security posture of any system, basically. And an architecture, a zero trust architecture, is based on these zero trust principles and designed to prevent data breaches and limit internal lateral movement. So again, these two things are very well aligned because they build on one another around reducing the implicit trust, reducing access across the network, and continually enforcing access controls and enforcing the principle of least privilege. So there's four core principles that are important to understand here. So the first is that all communication is secured regardless of network location. And that really should be interpreted as no matter who the identity is, whether it's a human user or a non-human user, and no matter what resources they're accessing, whether it's a traditional on-premises resource or a newer cloud-based resource, that communication needs to be secured. And by secured, we mean not just encrypted, but moving to the second principle, that access to these resources is determined by a dynamic policy. And that policy, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is something that looks at the full context of the user and their identity and their device and the resource being accessed to make a determination, should this identity be allowed to access this resource right now at this point in time, given everything that we know about the current context. And that's the dynamic aspect of it. It's not a fixed and static policy. It's a policy that depends on a lot of interesting things. And that's really the third bullet point, which is principle of least privilege, very strictly enforced. No access is going to be allowed until and unless this policy gets positively evaluated. And then finally, the last principle is that there needs to be continuous and ongoing monitoring and measuring of the system so that if things change, access can be changed. If anomalous behavior is detected, then the system or the device can be quickly remediated or quarantined. If we think about conceptually what this looks like, and this diagram is from the NIST Zero Trust Architecture report, there's a few core elements in here. So the first is this notion at the top of the policy decision point, or PDP. And that acts as the brain of the system. And like its name implies, it's making decisions about policies to determine should the subject, you can see in the bottom part, using a given system right now, using a computer system, be allowed to access an enterprise resource. And that access happens through a policy enforcement point, or PEP. So the PDP, the policy decision point, makes a decision, and it communicates that decision to the policy enforcement point, which is then responsible for allowing or disallowing the actual network traffic and the data to flow. There's a separation here of the control plane and the data plane, which is a common pattern that is useful, because you can have now distributed policy enforcement points that are across the network, and you'll see on the next diagram ways in which that might work, but a centralized and easier to manage policy decision point. Now, how does a policy decision point make decisions? Obviously, there's a database of sorts around policy, but most importantly is the policy decision point needs to take as input information about the identity, the device, the overall state of the environment. And this is what these 8 boxes on the left side and the right side are intended to provide. Is if you look at some of these things, like a continuous diagnostics and measurement, or CDM system, a threat intelligence system, a certificate or PKI infrastructure, identity management, or SIM system. These are examples of the types of enterprise and security infrastructure that need to be taken into consideration by the policy decision points policy model. So you can easily imagine an environment where, let's say we have an endpoint management system that is providing a risk score about the device the user is using. And that risk score can and should be really useful input to the policy decision point. Because if the user is trying to access a very high value resource and they're on a system that is, maybe it hasn't been patched or updated in a long time, it's running a really old version of Windows, for example, that should probably or possibly be blocked. If the user, however, is on a device that is reported by the endpoint management system as being up to date, it's got its antivirus running, it's got a corporate or organization issued certificate that is installed on it, that device meets all of our checkboxes, and that user should probably be allowed to access that resource, assuming all the other things match. So if we think about this picture and we kind of generalize it, you can think about on the bottom there, we have a very heterogeneous set of infrastructure components. So we've got workloads and data that are running lots of different environments and using lots of different technology. And each of those things needs some sort of policy enforcement point logically in front of it to allow or disallow access. And the architectures behind this are going to vary based on vendor and platform, but logically, there's a policy enforcement point that sits across the network, sits in these environments, and prevents access, allows or disallows access based on what the policy decision point tells it. The interesting thing about Zero Trust is you can see this horizontal box is there can and there should be, there really ideally is, a unified and holistic policy model that works across all of these different technologies and all these different environments. And that really simplifies things, and it breaks down traditional barriers that we have, traditional silos in enterprise environments. And we'll see in a couple of slides an illustration of that. The policy decision point, which is what's making these decisions, needs to take risk and event-based decisions. And it needs to do that based on context that it gets from things like an identity management system or a security infrastructure, maybe a SIM, an endpoint management system, et cetera, and allows the user to authenticate, to have their device security posture evaluated, and to make a decision about should a user have access to a resource at this point in time. The system itself is also dynamic. You can see the PDP is not just getting contextual information from those enterprise systems. It can and should also be receiving events. So if an endpoint management system, for example, or a SIM detects some sort of anomalous activity, then that system needs to have a way to tell the Zero Trust platform, the PDP, hey, you know what? I've noticed some anomalous activity from this user's device or on this network segment or from this server. And that event needs to go into the PDP, and the system needs to be able to quickly react to that and respond to quarantine or shut down access to a given system, or maybe just to prompt the user for step-up authentication. This is at the heart of the policy and the heart of what makes Zero Trust a much more effective solution than traditional siloed enterprise security solutions. So let's talk about policies, because these are at the heart of what we do. So we're going to make a bold claim here and say that firewall rules are not policies, and hopefully no one will argue with that. So if we think about what a firewall rule looks like, and you can see an example at the bottom, it's the traditional, what's called a 5-tuple, where it's got 5 pieces of information in it. It's got a source IP address or subnet, a destination IP address or subnet, a protocol, and a destination port. And this is kind of the most basic and most ubiquitous way that access is controlled at the network layer. And there's lots of problems with this, right? This is not a policy. There's nothing in here whatsoever about the identity, about the context, about the sensitivity of the resource, et cetera. And for many, many years, security and networking teams have really tried to use this or misuse this as a security mechanism. And it's really not. And that's why we've had so many challenges around security and so many widespread breaches. So if we think about what a policy, what a Zero Trust policy really needs to look like, it needs to have these elements in it. So this model comes from the NSTAC report. It's called the Kipling method, based on a poem about who, what, when, where, why, and how. And what a Zero Trust policy says, according to this structure, which I think is very, very useful, is it's a mechanism that allows all the way up to layer 7 to be able to determine what network traffic is allowed to go through the policy enforcement point, they call the microperimeter, and to block all unauthorized access. And the policy needs to take into consideration who's the identity, what is being accessed, when is that access permitted to happen or being tried to happen, where is the resource located in terms of technology or physical location, why is this access allowed, and how should the traffic be processed. In this example, it shows people who are in the administrative group who are trying to access the directory administration tool can access this if they're prompted for MFA successfully. It's going to be allowed for them 24/7 to this directory server location, and if and only if the IDS is using deep packet inspection to control access to it. So this is an example of a logical policy. And one of the reasons that this is important is you think about traditional tools have these barriers or these silos or these gaps between them. So you think about it, there's traditionally at the highest level, at the identity level, applications require authentication, and it's oftentimes based on group membership. And that's great, right? That's a starting point, but it's not sufficient, because if I'm not in a directory group, okay, I can't sign into, let's say, a sensitive piece of information like the company's financial management system. I don't work in finance, I don't have credentials, I don't have a login. I can't log in and get to that, but I can see that system on the network. And the malware that's on my device can also see that system on the network. So we can say, oh, this is a juicy target. I'm going to start to try to guess the administrative credentials, or I'm going to brute force it, or I'm going to take advantage of a known vulnerability, because this malware can see the device on the network, can see that server on the network. Second layer down is device management or device posture check. That's not tied in traditionally to an access decision. So you may have a device management system, an endpoint management system in your environment. It may do network scans, device scans, and give you a score or an assessment of a user device. But that doesn't, these traditional network security systems that are isolated from one another don't have the ability to tie that device score into a real-time access decision. And then finally, at the network layer, there are very different technologies used for remote access, VPNs, and on-premises user access, so things like a network access control or local area network firewall rules or routing configurations. Likewise, there's going to be a separate system for wide area network. So these things are isolated from one another, and it's really hampered the enterprise's ability to control access, because it's crazy, if you think about it, to have one set of tools and one set of access control systems for users who are in the building, and then they leave the building to go down the street to a coffee shop, and now they VPN in, and guess what? They're using a completely different set of technologies and have a completely different set of access rules that apply to them. It doesn't make sense to do that. It doesn't make sense to have things that are going to be misaligned, because you're duplicating the expense. You've got different ways and different access control, and you're wasting people's time as well. So a zero trust policy, given our friends of who, what, when, where, why, how, really allow us to ask the interesting questions that we need to ask, that we need to have embedded in our policies. So we think about our traditional firewall question of, should this source IP be allowed to access a target IP? As we mentioned, that's a terrible question. It's a really poor way to try to do security. And really, we need to ask questions like, should Alice be allowed to access the financial system web UI? That's a much more meaningful and much more interesting question. And really, we of course don't want to have policies or rules or decisions about Alice as an individual. It should be about groups of users. So really, the question that we need to embed in our policy, and the question that is going to be useful for us as an enterprise outside of just security to ask is, under what circumstances should an identity be allowed to access the financial system web UI? Now that's a really meaningful question. And like most meaningful questions, there's some really interesting aspects to it. You can see these bullet points here of, okay, what's a reasonable policy around that? Well, it would be, this person needs to be an employee. They need to be in the finance team group, because they're the only people whose jobs require them to access this sensitive resource. We want them on a corporate managed device. We want to have an endpoint system, our device endpoint management system, give them a risk score of less than 75 out of 100. We want to make sure that they're only connecting from countries where we do business. They use MFA. In fact, they've been prompted for MFA in the last 2 hours, because this is sensitive financial information. We're a publicly traded company, et cetera. We want to make sure maybe that this person only accesses during normal working hours. And I know we all work crazy hours, so maybe that's not the best policy, but for some roles that will be important. And we also want to make sure that the device is not acting anomalously. Maybe there's some malware on the device because they clicked on a phishing link. If that device is doing things like a port scan, even if everything else is valid, if the other 7 bullet points are valid, we really don't want that device to connect to our sensitive financial management system. So this is a really interesting policy that has been very difficult, if not impossible, for organizations to express previously using traditional architectures and using traditional tools. And what these things have in common is that they actually have meaning to regular human beings, by which I mean people who aren't network security engineers or security architects. So, you know, I count myself in those groups, right? I love technology and I love those things, but those things are not meaningful to the business or to the compliance team, to the operations team, or to business groups like HR, et cetera. The things that are circled here are meaningful and are in fact what the line of business or the application owner wants and needs to enforce, and are the things that organizations have to document and prove that they're enforcing for their auditors or for compliance reasons. So zero trust allows us to elevate these policies away from those firewall rules into the really relevant questions that we as organizations need to answer. So we think about now zero trust maturity models. As I mentioned, really the primary one, the most highly regarded one in the industry, comes from the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And there's lots of maturity models out there. Many security vendors have them, many consulting companies have them, and there's probably 50 plus at this point. This one is really highly regarded in the industry and has become, I would say, the baseline for a lot of the thinking and frameworks in the industry. And in fact, version 2 of this just came out last week. And what this model does is it introduces these 5 core pillars around identity, devices, networks, applications and workloads, and data. And it also introduces what are called cross-cutting concerns, these things like visibility and analytics, automation and orchestration and governance. Those 3 things are really important. And of course, they span all 5 of those pillars. and it's important to have a consistent methodology for all of those across the different pillars. This report is well worth reading, and I'm not going to go through it in detail because that's a much longer process. But what they've done is they introduced 4 different levels of maturity, starting with the least mature using traditional or taking a traditional approach. And these are things like where you have manual processes or manual assignment of attributes, static security policies, etc. And as organizations begin their zero trust journey, they'll move through these phases called initial, advanced, and optimal. And you can see, reading some of this, that in the initial phase, organizations will begin the automation of attribute assignment configuration. They will begin automating policy decisions and enforcement. And as they get more advanced or more mature, they will have much more dynamic controls. They'll have policy enforcement that crosses some of those pillars. And at the highest level of maturity, the goal is to have really just-in-time provisioning or assignment of attributes, policies that are self-reporting or self-documenting from a compliance perspective, et cetera. So this is a really great vision for moving up the maturity model. You can see the pillars here, identity, devices, et cetera. And here you can see going from the bottom at traditional up through optimal. I want to drill down on the identity one really briefly. So if you think about this, and I've just reoriented this from left to right, where a traditional identity pillar organization that's traditional would be using passwords, sure, or MFA, maybe not together. They probably have a traditional on-premises identity store running inside their enterprise, which has a lot of challenges, technical challenges, when your users are no longer in the building on the local area network, when they're remote. They probably have some limited risk assessment that the identity system isn't using or can't use because maybe it's from a different vendor or it's incompatible for some reason. And they grant users permanent access through a periodic, maybe it's an annual review. As organizations move up the maturity model, you can see when they're in the initial phase, now they're starting to do things like applying MFA, probably some sort of step-up authentication. They've got identity stores that maybe they're hosting them in the cloud environment, but maybe they're running them themselves. They've got some sort of identity risk assessments that maybe it's manual or maybe there's some manual integration between systems. And you might have an access review system that's still periodic. It still automatically happens, but you would at least have a mechanism where access would expire if it's not positively reinforced. As organizations move up the chain, you can see that you would have the adoption of better MFA technologies, things that are more phishing resistant. For example, maybe they're moving to an authenticator app or a hardware token rather than SMS. They're moving identity stores to an integrated and potentially federated identity system that's running in a cloud environment. And they're starting to have a need or session-based access where you might get temporary or ephemeral credentials that are assigned. And then finally, at the highest level, you would get continuous validation. You get integrated risk assessment from, let's say, the endpoint management system that feeds into this. And you would have a small number of identity systems that work across the whole entire enterprise, ideally one, but at least a pretty small number. Inside each of these pillars, what the maturity model does is it also breaks things down further, which is really, really helpful, right? So you can see here, they've got just these 4 pillars here around identity. So authentication, identity stores, risk assessments, and access management. And for each of these, they provide some guidance around what a traditional, initial, advanced, and optimal organization might look like. So you can see this is really useful for organizations to do an assessment and to start to plan around how they move up and what the priority should be for them to move up. So for example, an organization might say, okay, you know what? We're here in the traditional column for risk assessments, let's say, and it's important for us to move up. So we're going to start doing, step 2, where we have manual methods and static rules, but really we want to get to automatic analysis and dynamic rules of risk assessment for user access. So this framework is really useful for organizations to start their journey. Okay, I want to, let's see. I think we will have a few slides here to talk about the conclusion, then we can open it for Q&A. So we talked a lot about documents and kind of publications and thought leadership that have come from the United States. I mentioned the National Institute for Standards and Technology, I mentioned CISA, but even though this has been a trend that has that the US federal government has put a lot of effort into, and in fact, the US federal government issued a mandate from President Biden that all US federal agencies have to adopt zero trust starting pretty much immediately. But this really is a worldwide trend. We've seen governments around the world publicly embrace zero trust and begin their journeys. So countries like Singapore and Estonia, the UK and Australia have been fairly vocal about this. I know there are a lot of other countries that are also looking to their security leadership to embrace this. So it's a pretty exciting time, and I think that it really represents, zero trust really represents a better way to approach this. And there's definitely some data to support this. So Okta, who was one of the leading identity providers, performed a survey a few months ago, and you can see here that in the Asia Pacific region, 50% of organizations are implementing zero trust and 46% plan to. So that obviously adds up to 96%, which is a pretty high number. In Europe, Middle East, and Africa, or the EMEA region, the numbers are fairly similar, right? They seem to be a little bit more ahead, where 45% are implementing and 53% plan to. So about the same, but again, that adds up to 98%. So that's a pretty substantial number. So I think it's pretty clear that organizations are really understanding and getting started with this. We also see worldwide representation and activity in the Cloud Security Alliance. So the Cloud Security Alliance for the CSA is a nonprofit industry consortium. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Zero Trust Working Group there, and we've really seen a terrific increase in participation, not just from the United States, but people from Asia, people from Europe, who are interested in participating. And I would encourage all of you to take a look at the Cloud Security Alliance. It's free to join as an individual member, and we love having participants to talk with, to explore, and to help contribute to some of the work that we're doing there. So to recap, Zero Trust is a new security paradigm. It's a security philosophy, and it's a security approach. And what it does is it enables dynamic and contextually aware policies. It takes us away from those firewall rules, which are not about security and have no context, and moves us to being able to define in our organization meaningful policies that are built around identity and context. And what it does is it helps organizations become a lot more resilient, a lot more effective, a lot more efficient. And it does this by integrating with other elements of the security and the IT ecosystem and infrastructure. And it actually helps enterprises get more value out of those things. So imagine they've invested in a endpoint management system. Now you can take the risk scores or the device posture that comes from that endpoint management system and take it as an input into your policy engine, your policy decision point, and have that actually impact whether or how a user can access the system. So now you can do things like, you know what, my developers who are accessing the source code in my environment, which is my highest value asset, they need to have a very low risk score on their device because that's just an easy attack vector. And we've certainly seen time and time again where malware, where malicious actors use developers as an entry point into the network to get access to an organization's crown jewels. Zero Trust really is a proven way toward getting better and more effective security. We're getting to see some really interesting case studies from enterprises about how they've approached this. And if you're interested in some of those, take a look at the Cloud Security Alliance. They have what's called the Zero Trust Advancement Center, and there's a set of resources that include links to some case study replays. I also want to encourage enterprises to recognize that even though Zero Trust is a multi-year journey, if you think about going from, we go back for a moment here, a picture like this, right, where you go from maybe your traditional or initial in some areas up to optimal, that's definitely a significant initiative and definitely going to take years to do. But organizations can and should get started incrementally and deliver value pretty quickly. And in fact, I would say that's a prerequisite for projects where you can't. It's much more difficult to start in the project where you say, okay, we're going to do this big project and it's going to take us 12 months before we deliver any value, versus we're going to do something and in 6 weeks or 8 weeks, we're going to deliver value to the organization. We're going to get rid of this headache that this business unit is having. We're going to eliminate the VPN that is causing all sorts of problems for people. We're going to enable the business to take advantage of some new cloud-based technologies and move applications up to the cloud in a way that's secure and faster and better. So that's some of the things that in my latest book, which is called Getting Started with Zero Trust, I talk about 5 on-ramps, 5 ways for organizations to begin zero trust initiatives quickly and deliver value rapidly to the organization. And when you do that, when you think about that, part of one of the success factors is really, I would say, getting out of our traditional comfort zone, right? Like, I love technology, but the fact that something is interesting technically or provides obvious security value isn't going to be meaningful to someone who's running HR or running manufacturing. And it's really important to start to build connections with peers inside your enterprise. So talk to those people, really understand what their frustrations are, what do they dislike about the current security or access solutions, compliance solutions, what are they trying to do, what sort of business initiatives they have going on. And those things are often great projects to say, okay, great, you're migrating your manufacturing planning system, from vendor A to vendor B. Okay, let's talk about the security and the aspect parts of that. And by making that easier, by eliminating some of the headaches, you can really get supporters in the business to start down your zero trust journey. So there's very common first zero trust projects. You can see them listed here. So VPN replacement is a common one. Controlling privileged user access, enabling secure third-party access is important. DevOps is a great initiative if your organization is doing that. Cloud migration or moving applications up to the cloud, and securing legacy apps. All of those things are really good, important, really good initial projects. So for example, let's just talk about securing legacy apps for a moment. You may have a security need or a compliance need to provide better authentication and stronger security for people who are accessing legacy applications which can't be changed. And by layering zero trust on top of that, you can do that, improve the user experience, meet your compliance needs very easily without a lot of effort. And that can help you gain some momentum for your zero trust project. As I mentioned, don't try to do everything all at once. Start with initial, smaller and focused projects. Get some momentum and learn how your organization works and learn how your chosen technology platform is going to work as well. And finally, accept a solution that's going to be imperfect, right? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because if you're in a less mature state in various areas, every incremental improvement is going to help. And don't strive for a perfect solution on day one, because it's not going to be day one, it's going to be day 3000, versus let's strive for a good solution on day 30 or day 45 to deliver value to the business, and then let's build on it from there, because no one can know everything up front. This is a journey that to take together with your peers, with your organization, and there's so much to learn along the way that we just got to get started. Okay, finally, to wrap up here, zero trust is really about having automated and transparent security for your organization. And we as security professionals have an obligation to protect our employees, to protect our employers, and give them an environment that is efficient and resilient and secure, meeting the traditional triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And a zero trust architecture allows us to do that. And it's much, much more effective and much easier to do that with this new approach than using traditional tools and traditional architectures. And really where we want to get to is security that's automated. So access policies and systems that automatically adapt to changes in identities, changes in the environment, changes in the devices based on context. And we also want it to be transparent, where users just turn on their device, and they do their job, and security happens behind the scenes for them. And yeah, they get prompted occasionally for maybe step-up authentication, but for the ideal security system is just something that works really well and is transparent to users with minimal friction. And ideally, it can also be something that's clear to users so that when there's a false positive or someone is incorrectly blocked, there's some guidance to them, to the help desk, and to the security team, so that can be quickly remediated. If someone's blocked from using an application and they need to make one phone call or send one ticket, and 5 minutes later they have access, it's not a big deal. If someone's blocked for hours or days, it is a big problem, and that's where and how security teams sometimes get into real conflict with the end users. So with that, I want to thank you. We covered a lot of material here around what Zero Trust is. We talked about maturity models. We talked about Zero Trust policies, and I gave some guidance here on how to get started with Zero Trust. So now we've got time for Q&A. All right. So please submit your questions through the Q&A widget.
Thank you very much, Jason, for an informative session, and our attendees share the same sentiments. Now, before we begin with the Q&A, I would like to inform all the attendees that this session is in sync with EC Council CTIA program. EC Council CTIA maps to many roles in the industries like threat intelligence analyst, threat analyst and reporting, vulnerability management, and threat intelligence engineer, etc. Anyone with a CTIA certification is eligible for 9,000 plus job vacancies globally with an average salary of $100,000 and $324. If you're interested to learn more, kindly take part in the poll that's going to be conducted now. Let us know your preferred mode of training and we'll reach out to you soon.
Okay. Thank you, Shilpi. While we're waiting for questions to come in, there's some common questions that often happen that I'm often asked. So one of them is, what sort of prerequisites are there for my organization to get started with Zero Trust? And I would say that make sure that you're doing the basics of information security. No one has a perfect security organization, and Zero Trust is so valuable and it's so important to get started that I would say in the vast majority of cases, you can get started right now. But if your organization hasn't prioritized or invested in some of the basics, then clearly you need to do that. So I'm talking about things like making sure that you encrypt traffic, making sure that you have an identity management system that properly onboards and offboards users so that when someone leaves the organization, their access is cut off. Making sure that you have backups and tested recovery processes for your data and your systems, because it's far too easy for ransomware or malware to run across a traditional network. And that's got to be something where you have a high degree of confidence that if a system is compromised, you can rebuild it from the ground up in a relatively quick amount of time. And then finally, making sure that your system administrators in particular have multi-factor authentication, they're not sharing credentials, and maybe there's a privileged access management system in place for credential vaulting, et cetera. So those are information security basics that most organizations are doing and are doing a reasonably good job at. I would say that there's not really a high barrier to getting started with Zero Trust. Okay, let's see. Another question is around initial projects or how to get started. So I mentioned a number of initial projects here. So VPN replacement, privileged user access, third-party access, DevOps, cloud migration, and securing legacy apps. So those are great candidates. And of course, even within those, there are probably smaller projects that you can find that'll be really good candidates. And this is where it's important to begin building connections and understanding what's happening in your business. Is there a migration from an old version of one business system to another? Is the organization embracing new technology like moving applications up to a cloud or rewriting them in cloud native architecture? Has there been maybe an incident of some sort? Is there an audit finding that needs to be addressed? Or what new line of business, what new revenue generating initiatives is the business beginning? All of those things are really good candidates to get started with Zero Trust, because when you do that, it becomes a business-driven initiative that security is influencing and helping and accelerating. And that's a much easier conversation to have, and you get a lot more enthusiasm by the end users and the application owners and the infrastructure team, compared to it being strictly a security-led initiative where you're pushing this rock uphill to try to get these things done, and you might have pushback from lots of different teams across the organization. If, for example, you go to a user population and you say, hey, we're changing the way you do access, and we're going to move from the VPN to this other solution, and here's how you do it, and the user experience is basically the same and their access is the same, and that might not be something that they would love to do, because it's just a change for them, but it doesn't give any value. Compare that to, hey, we're replacing this VPN that everyone hates. Why do we hate the VPN? Well, it's slow, it drops connections, you have to remember to turn it on and off because it doesn't work with this application and you have to use it for that application. And certain teams can't use it because they have different technology requirements in terms of network protocols. If you do that and you say, guess what? We're moving to this new access method and it's going to automatically turn on when your device boots up and you don't have to worry about it, it's faster, it's more reliable, then you're going to make a lot of friends and people are going to really support you in that process. That's one example. So I would definitely encourage you to talk to folks in your organization, understand what your business mission and your business initiatives are, and use those as opportunities to really begin a Zero Trust initiative. Right. Any questions? Go ahead, Shilpi.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason, for answering that questions, like explaining it in such a way. Okay, so our first question is by Clement. In terms of continuous monitoring, do you know any tool that I can use to cover all the pillars?
I can't recommend any specific vendors there, and I think Clement's question is quite valid. If you think about the pillars here, what Clement is asking about, okay, there's this cross-cutting thing called visibility and analytics, and what tools can exist or do exist that can do monitoring across this. I don't have a clear answer that would, or be able to say, use vendor A or vendor B. And I think that's definitely a challenge, because these systems are sending telemetry and sending data at so many different levels, right? You've got this gigantic amount of network traffic monitoring that's happening. Those typically go to network monitoring tools. You've got application systems that are sending log data, and those might go to SIMs, for example. And you've got devices that are being monitored by endpoint management systems. So I don't have an answer other than maybe use an enterprise SIM system and utilize a set of dashboards that can help you look at and identify just the key aspects of those across those environments.
Thank you, Jason, for answering that question. Our next question is by Vahid. Many new companies are talking about Zero Trust. What is a good way to evaluate that this company is implemented and supports Zero Trust?
I guess there's two possible answers to that, right? One is the new company a software vendor, or is the company an enterprise? So I think if we think about a software vendor, there's definitely a big trend in the industry for software vendors to say, hey, we support Zero Trust. Here's how we do it. Buy our product, buy our solution, and the enterprise can obtain the benefits and do Zero Trust. And I think that's one of the challenges in the industry is when you have a really big trend like Zero Trust, and you have budgets and projects and enterprises that are prioritizing going down the Zero Trust journey, it becomes very natural for many software vendors or solution providers to say, oh, well, we do zero trust too. And because zero trust is a strategy, there is a big, does have a big net, so to speak, where you have lots of vendors who what they're offering is does make sense in that space. But you do also have vendors who really will stretch things, and they're just trying to be opportunistic to say, oh, you know what? All my prospects have zero trust projects and zero trust budgets. So, we want to get a piece of that pie too. So of course, what we do is zero trust. So it's definitely a challenge, and I would suggest, look at the maturity model here, and don't be too quick to, I would say, use a single vendor's model for this. I mean, there's some vendors that are very credible, right? The bigger vendors, the leaders in these spaces. Some vendors that are perhaps a little bit more focused, I would say, may not tie in as well to this. So I think really what it's important to do is get a good sense for your enterprise, where you sit in this maturity model across these different pillars, and then use a framework like this to say, okay, I know where we are. We're at the initial phase for this, and we're trying to do A, B, and C, and we're at the traditional phase for that, and we're trying to do D, E, and F to go move up the maturity model. And then be able to look at a vendor. Then you'll have a framework where if a vendor says, hey, we do, let's say it's device management. We do device management for zero trust. Then you'll be able to say, okay, tell me, how you're going to help me get from this initial phase where I am today up to the advanced phase. And then you'll have a framework to objectively evaluate these vendor claims. I think that's probably the best way to do it, given that this maturity model is independent and objective and it's vendor neutral.
Thank you, Jason, for answering that question. Our next question is by Gregor. Do you know any good tools or technologies and more practical advices to create a test environment as a proof of concept for management?
I think there's a very broad ecosystem here for sure. So I can't recommend a specific tool. I mean, there's definitely some open source tools. I would also recommend that if you look at the major cloud providers, so Microsoft and Amazon Web Services and Google, they all have very easy, oftentimes free ways to get started using some of their tools and their platforms. And of course, there's third-party libraries or third-party systems, third-party vendors that can plug into those environments, oftentimes at a very low cost, maybe a few dollars a month or at a free tier. And those are great ways to get started, because in those cases, you're working with those three cloud providers, all provide state-of-the-art, world-class environments, and you can choose your set of security vendors or tools that work in those environments as well. So there's a really rich ecosystem to start with. I would also recommend the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the United States has a group called the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, or NCCOE. And they have a project around zero trust architectures. And what they've done is they've assembled a testing ecosystem of about 30, somewhere between 20 and 30 vendors. And they've done this in a very open and public way, where they have an environment, several environments in their lab that have assembled and tied these different vendors together. So I would recommend taking a look at that. That group has spent probably close to 2 years at this point really building that out, and there's a lot of value in that, and it's all open and freely available. So if you search for NIST NCCOE, or the document is called 1800-35, you'll see a number of documents there, and that would be a really good starting point as well.
Thank you, Jason. I'll take last question for the day. This question is by Mohammed. It seems that zero trust is costly, so it is difficult for small and medium enterprises. What is your opinion?
So I think I wouldn't say that it's costly. I would say that it's definitely an investment. And in fact, in some cases, there can be cost savings. We've seen organizations reduce the number of security tools or access or networking tools that they're using. We've seen organizations retire some security hardware. We've seen organizations save significant amounts of money on wide area networks, in particular doing things like retiring expensive MPLS circuits. But I hear your question, and especially for smaller or medium businesses, and maybe there's not a lot of infrastructure to be retired, maybe you're not using expensive wide area networks, but what you're gaining is efficiency, and you're eliminating manual work in many cases that people are performing today. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to line up with your business counterparts to understand where is the business investing, where there are headaches. And if you can find something like, hey, we are required to do these audit and compliance reports every 3 months, and it takes us 100 hours of people's time, and it's a real headache and no one likes it because it's such a distraction from their day job. If you can eliminate that or reduce it by 90%, that's a big win. That's a big cost savings, even though it's not saving hard dollars that are being spent, it's a big win in the organization.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you again to our wonderful speaker, Jason, for answering those questions and for the great presentation and the knowledge shared to our global audiences. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and we are looking forward to more and more sessions with you. Before we conclude the webinar, would you like to give a small message to our audiences?
Thank you for attending, and I would encourage you to take a look at what Zero Trust has to offer. I'm a real believer in the value that it provides, and that we have a responsibility as security professionals to move our organizations forward. If you want to reach out to me, feel free. You can find my information at numberlinesecurity.com or on LinkedIn. And thank you again to the EC Council.
Thank you so much, Jason, for the message to our audiences. Before we end the session, I would like to announce our next CyberTalk session, Ethical Hacking for Cloud Security, Best Practices and Tools, which is scheduled for April 25th, 2023. This session is an expert presentation by Senthil Velathan, Staff Cloud Solution Architect, VMware. To register for this session, please do go visit our website www.eccu.edu/cybertalks. The link is given in the chat section. Hope to see you all on April 25th. With this, we end the session. You may now disconnect your lines. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.